What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be diving into the 10 most popular decks right now being played in MTG Arena for standard best of one. Now that Phyrexia All BO1 has released, we are kind of seeing what people are playing, what people are playing a lot of when it comes to games. And this list is not going to be a meta list. This is more of what's popular regardless of win rate overall, and these are just based on matches played. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. The first deck up on this list is going to be Selesnya Enchantments, and this is just one of those decks that is tried and true. It's been around since Kamigawa in various variations, and since the rotation this past September. This is just a deck that's just kind of existed. Very approachable for a budget-friendly player, as it's mostly uncommons and commons with a few select rares in the deck, and it's definitely a list that, you know, has been fine-tuned to the exact numbers you probably need of said cards in the deck, and it definitely makes sense as to why it's pretty popular, as it can win games, especially against other decks where people are still experimenting with numbers of how many cards they are playing. And Selesnya Enchantments is still something to be reckoned with when it comes to playing against it. The next deck up on this list is going to be 5-color control, and I think the reason why this deck makes the list is a lot of people are excited about Atraxa Grand Unifier as being a new card being added into the set. This is a very powerful card overall, and this list is definitely something that performed fairly well for the most part, as this is a list, especially in best of one, that you can cheat out spells typically earlier than you normally should. And, you know, using cards like Invoke Justice and maybe Catalytic Information to play these more high premium spells for basically less than you normally would cast them for is definitely a reason why people like to play these more aggressive, greedy decks that play powerful spells. But overall, very good list, and like I said, new card makes sense as to why it makes the list as being a popular deck. The next deck up on this list is going to be Mono Green Ramp. I think this is a list that, you know, people are really trying to make Mono Green work. We got some new fun Mono Green toys in the new set, one being Nissa, the Ascendant Animus, the 7-mana Planeswalker with some really good abilities, +1 to get a token based on her loyalty, -1 to destroy target artifact or enchantment, or -7 and giving everything +1/+1 for each forest, and Trample, essentially create a hoof behemoth kind of effect based on how many lands you control. The other one being Thrun, Breaker of Silence, another solid 5-drop. That's definitely a fun card for the deck, as it's a spell that can't be countered, has Trample, can't be the target of non-green spells opponents control or abilities of non-green sources your opponents control, so very hard to remove that way unless it's a global effect, and also is indestructible as long as it's your turn, so definitely very solid there. Outside of that, most of the cards you see here are definitely cards that have just existed in the green space, but I would say with some of these new toys, I do think people are really trying to make mono green work, and this is definitely a good starting point if you're really trying to play with mono green. This is definitely a good place to start with, as I do think the ramp strategy is probably the best, as you want to try to get to your top end as quickly as possible, and then overwhelm your opponent with very powerful spells. This is definitely a good list to go off of. The next deck up on this list is going to be Mono Blue Tempo. Mono Blue Tempo is one of those decks that really didn't get any new tools with the new set, but it's a very solid deck from top to bottom. It's just definitely tempoing out your opponent in that early game, keeping the board as clear as possible, eventually playing a bunch of counter spells and bounce spells to then play your Haughty Djinn to protect it, and then hopefully swing in for damage. It's a very fine-tuned list. It's not the most fun deck to play against, but if you're someone who likes to play control but you're on a budget, this is probably the list that you're going to play with. It's definitely a good deck overall, and it definitely makes sense as, yet again, it's a list that's fine-tuned. It's another reason why people are probably playing it, and as popular as it is currently with a meta that is still fairly on the new side. The next deck up on this list is going to be Selesnya Toxic. Selesnya Toxic is a different approach, I think, to the overall Toxic mechanic. This one's really not trying to do anything super crazy. It's just trying to beat your opponent down with creatures that have Toxic. Venerated Rot Priest is here as more of a protection kind of thing. So if your opponents target your creatures with any spells, you're going to give them a poison counter regardless, and it's kind of the reason why he's in the list. Overall, the rest of the creatures in the deck just have Toxic on them of, you know, 1 or 2, and then we have cards in it that eventually, as the game goes on, we get the Corrupted ability, and that turns on, and it allows us to get other advantages with our creatures with Toxic. I guess the Skrull of Hive is kind of the other card I would say that works very well in this deck, because once they get to 3, all your creatures with Toxic also gain lifelink, so it's going to make them super powerful and definitely annoying for your opponent to beat you down damage-wise. But overall, it's another interesting list. I think a different approach, I think, to Toxic. I think maybe it's the better approach to Toxic, just because you're going to still be able to beat your opponent down and put pressure on them, not just on their poison, but you'll put pressure on their life total as well with this deck, and definitely a fun approach, I would say, to the overall mechanic. And we move on to the deck of the set so far. This is Simic Toxic. People are excited yet again about Venerated Rot Priest. Ivy is kind of a good combo card with Venerated Rot Priest, because of the idea here is that whenever one of your spells targets a creature you control, Ivy triggers. You can then copy that spell with Ivy, create another Rot Priest trigger, and depending on what the spell is, getting additional triggers of said spell is definitely very good. This version is a little bit more on the heavier rare side than a version I did previously on the channel. It's definitely a good deck overall, but I would say this is more of a boom bust type deck, as you really need these two to really make the deck work. If you don't really have them out, it's going to be a little bit of a slow grind to really wither your opponent down slowly but surely with poison. But still, overall fun list, and I do think this is one of those decks that you'll see everywhere for maybe a week or two, and then people either see that it's not really super well and kind of fall off from it, but it's definitely a list that you'll probably see at least for the next week or two still going forward until really the meta settles. The next deck up on this list is going to be Mono Black Control. And Mono Black Control is one of those decks that's tried and true. You know, it's proven to be a very competitive deck, as it does have some of the most powerful spells currently in Standard. This version, in particular, though, does play some new cards with Phyrexian Arena as a more aggressive way to draw an additional card at the beginning of your upkeep at the cost of 1 life. The other one being Phyrexian Obliterator, a solid 4-drop that's a 5/5, and any source of damage that would be dealt to Phyrexian Obliterator makes that controller sacrifice that many permanents. Another card that's super powerful in the sense of if they don't have spot removal, this is a card that can easily take over the game, as it's really hard to deal with outside of spot removal in it. Other than that, the list really hasn't changed too much. I guess the only other thing that they added into this list is a couple of Drowning the Ichors as a way to proliferate and also give target creature -4/-4. -4/-4 is always good removal, just because it gets around things like indestructible. But for the most part, this is a list that's tried and true, has some of the the usual suspect cards in it, like Invoke Despair, Shieldred's another card, Bankbuster, Cut Down, those type of things. It's definitely a list that is very proven to win. Even with these new tools, I do think this list is pretty solid from top to bottom, and definitely a reason why the deck, the color choice and the deck type is still very popular in current Standard. Following the last deck, this is another deck that's proven to perform fairly well, and that is Mono Red Burn. Mono Red Burn is definitely another deck that can overwhelm your opponent very quickly with damage, as a lot of things in this deck either attack aggressively or do damage as they come in. This list in particular is just trying to do that. You have things like Voldarian Epicure, which itself doesn't seem like a very impressive creature, but the fact that it deals that 1 point of damage when it comes in the battlefield is pretty solid. Even though it doesn't have haste, it's as if it attacked, and you also get a blood token, which allows you to dig aggressively 4 cards to maybe answer your opponent. It has its fair share of burn spells in it with Play with Fire, Lightning Strike, make the list. Also added in things like Mastery Swiftspear, Phoenix Chick, and the Festivities, Squee, the typical cards you would see in Mono Red Burn. This is another list I think has been fine-tuned to the point that this is a very solid list to go with if you're looking to play this deck. And this deck is another deck that would perform fairly well in a meta where people are still experimenting, because it's just being aggressive and trying to finish your opponent before they really can take over the game with their bigger creatures. But overall, this list is pretty solid from top to bottom, and if you're an aggressive player, this is probably a good solid list to go off of if you're looking to get into playing some mono red. And the next deck up on this list is going to be Golgari Fight. This is another new deck list, I think, and it's definitely interesting to see it as high as it is currently on the most popular decks currently in MTG Arena for Standard. It's a list full of various cards. The main thing what we want to do here is kind of fight and clean the board up for the most part. One of the reasons why we want to fight is because this deck is playing Phyrexian Obliterator. Forcing the Obliterator to get dealt damage to make your opponent sacrifice things is definitely very strong. If you fight something that's a 5/5 with your 5/5, even though you may lose your Obliterator in the process, your opponent's still going to have to sacrifice 5 things. If the creature's bigger, they're going to sacrifice even more things, because all that damage is going to be dealt to Obliterator, which is definitely super strong. It's playing some of the other, usual suspects you would see in any deck that would contain black, as you see Invoke Despair, Cruelty to Gix, and Gix's Command both make the appearance. Another couple new cards I think that are in this deck that definitely make this deck a little bit better is one, you have a copy of Tyvar, just a good way to attack in aggressively and then untap that creature. You have Glissa here as one off, just another super good card I think currently. I think a little bit overlooked just because it doesn't seem super impressive as a 3-mana 3/3, but I do like the First Strike Death Touch, which is definitely very strong I think overall. And the only other card that I think is more of a new card in this deck list is going to be the Vraska's Betrayal Sting. It's a 6-mana Planeswalker with a bunch of abilities. One being drawing a card, losing a life, but proliferating. -2, just turning your opponent's creature into a treasure artifact that loses all card types and abilities. And if you get to the point of -9, you can give your opponent the difference between 0 and 9, and they get essentially 9 poison out of that. But overall, a very, very interesting deck list. Definitely cool to see, a little bit different of kind of like more of a gimmick being added into a deck, but a deck that can definitely overwhelm your opponent fairly quickly just because of the power of a lot of the cards in the deck overall. But definitely a fun list to try out if you're looking for something a little bit different than maybe what you're used to. And the last deck up on this list is going to be Azorius Soldiers. I don't think it was any surprise. If you were watching this from start to finish, you're probably like, I'm eventually going to see Soldiers, and it's currently the most popular deck currently in Arena. It's a solid deck from top to bottom. It's a deck that curves out very well if you've ever played it. It performs really well, as a lot of the creatures in the deck are super strong, as they have just not a creature ability, but they have additional ability built into the creature, which makes this deck super powerful, and a reason why the deck doesn't play any non-creature spells, which is definitely kind of interesting from the rest of the decks on this list. But yet again, in a new meta where people are still experimenting, when you are playing with a deck that's super fine-tuned against decks where people haven't really figured out what the perfect number of certain things are, you're going to see decks like this perform much better. It will definitely be interesting to see if this deck can continue to be the top deck of the format, but I do think as people kind of discover, what cards are good, what decks are bad, kind of thing, this deck may go down a couple of steps from being the most popular, as those decks will probably rise up to probably compete against it. And once this deck kind of starts losing out that win rate, people will move on to something else, more than likely whatever the next big, more popular deck is. But with that being said, I mean, these are the 10 decks I think are currently the most popular based on the Untapped.gg tracker thing. I'll have the link to the website down in the description below, as depending on which archetype you're looking at, there are fairly... And those are the 10 most popular decks currently in Standard. I would say it's a pretty even breakdown of stuff that is new and stuff that is from the prior meta. It's definitely kind of interesting to see people experiment and try new things, people playing the flavor of the month type of deck with the Toxic deck. But overall, for the most part, all these decks are pretty fun and unique depending on what kind of player you are. I have a link down in the description below for the Untapped.gg website where I pulled all these deck lists from, as I do think that depending on when you watch this video, the popularity of these decks can change, because it is one of those things that every day someone's maybe playing something different, so things go up, things go down. So it's possible that if you watch this video in 2 days, that some of these decks may not be at the top of the list where they are currently, as as people still figure out the decks in the meta. Decks will rise and decks will fall as the meta shifts and adjusts around based on what people are doing overall. Also, on screen, you'll see the 5 winners for the free pack codes that I was doing in my other video. I will also have a link down in the description below to the community post where I posted how you can reach out to me to get these codes if you are one of the winners that you see here on the screen. So if you are, let me know in the comments below or on the community post how you want to reach out to me so I know where to look for your message. I definitely appreciate it. If you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, I'll see you in the next video.